She looked her own daughter in the eye, smiled like a saint, and lied through every single word. Charlotte Whitmore had just stolen the man her daughter was about to marry, and she felt nothing. No guilt, no shame, only the cold satisfaction of a woman who believed love was a weapon, and she had always been the one holding it. If that disturbs you, stay with me, because this story gets so much darker. Before we go any further, please take a second to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let us begin. The summer heat in Savannah, Georgia in 1862 was the kind that pressed down on your chest like a hand that refused to let go. The war had been raging for over a year. Towns that had once buzzed with proud Confederate soldiers now smelled like grief and gunpowder. Cotton fields sat half-harvested. Horses were taken by armies. Young men were taken by graves. And the women left behind were expected to hold everything together with nothing but grace, silence, and the prayer that their world would not completely fall apart. Ravenwood Plantation was one of the largest estates left standing in the county. It sat at the end of a long oak-lined road, surrounded by fields that had once made the Whitmore family wealthy beyond reason. The great white columns of the house rose up like something out of a dream, or a nightmare, depending on who you asked. The servants who worked inside Ravenwood had a saying they only whispered among themselves when they were certain no one could hear. They said the house smiled at you when you arrived and swallowed you whole before you ever realized what was happening. Charlotte Whitmore was 46 years old the spring the war arrived at everyone's doorstep. She was tall, composed, and possessed a kind of beauty that did not fade the way most beauty did. It sharpened instead, became harder, more deliberate. Her dark hair was always pinned perfectly. Her voice never rose above a certain measured tone, even when she was furious, which made the words she chose all the more devastating. She wore her authority the way a queen wears a crown, not with aggression, but with an absolute certainty that it belonged to her and to no one else. 3 years earlier, her husband, Colonel Henry Whitmore, had died. The official cause of death was listed by the family doctor as a prolonged fever, the kind that swept through the South without warning. The servants said he went to bed healthy one evening and could not rise the following morning. He was buried quietly in the family cemetery at the edge of the property, and Charlotte had stood at his grave without shedding a single visible tear. She was not heartless, people told themselves. She was simply strong. After Henry died, Charlotte became Ravenwood. She made every decision. She controlled every account, every contract, every relationship the plantation had with the outside world. When men came to the estate on business, they quickly learned that the widow was not someone who needed an intermediary. She sat at the head of the table. She named her price first. She ended conversations when she chose to, not when anyone else did. And her daughter Evelyn had grown up watching all of this. Evelyn Whitmore was 21 in the spring of 1862, and she was the kind of young woman who made people feel instantly at ease. She had her mother's dark hair, but her father's gentle eyes, warm, searching, full of a genuine interest in whatever you were saying. She was not naive in the way some sheltered girls were naive. She understood the world she lived in. She understood the violence that underpinned the economy of their region, and it troubled her in ways she could rarely speak aloud because the words would have been seen as a betrayal of everything her family represented. She was kind to the people who worked on the plantation in ways that made Charlotte quietly furious, though Charlotte was always too composed to say so directly. "You are too familiar with them," Charlotte had told her daughter once, her voice low and precise, the way a blade is precise. Familiarity is weakness, and weakness invites catastrophe. Evelyn had nodded, but she had not changed. In the early spring of 1862, a young man rode up the long oak road to Ravenwood Plantation. and everything that followed can be traced back to that afternoon. His name was Thomas Caldwell. He was 28 years old, a lawyer by training, and a newly commissioned Confederate officer by obligation. He came from a respected family in Charleston, and had been introduced to Evelyn at a social gathering the previous autumn, before the war had truly begun eating the world alive. They had corresponded through letters since then, careful and formal at first, then warmer, then something that both of them recognized as something real. He came to Ravenwood that spring with the stated purpose of visiting Evelyn and the unstated but well-understood purpose of formally announcing his intentions to her family. He arrived in a gray coat, still dusty from the road, and Charlotte met him at the door before anyone else could. She looked at him for a long moment. She took in his height, his jawline, the way he held himself, not arrogant, but certain. The kind of certain that comes from a man who has been told since childhood that his instincts are worth trusting. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, extending her hand, "Evelyn has told me a great deal about you. None of it, I suspect, quite enough." Thomas smiled politely. He shook her hand. He said something appropriate and forgettable, and Charlotte smiled back at him with the expression of a woman who had already decided something important, though she would not have been able to name it out loud just yet. That evening, dinner at Ravenwood was a careful performance of Southern hospitality. Charlotte sat at the head of the table. Thomas sat to her right. Evelyn sat across from him. The conversation moved through the war, through politics, through the question of what the South would look like when the fighting ended. Thomas was thoughtful, measured, clearly intelligent. He spoke about law and about justice with a sincerity that Evelyn found moving and that Charlotte found interesting in a different way. After dinner, when Evelyn excused herself briefly to speak with one of the household staff about something in the kitchen, Charlotte leaned slightly toward Thomas and said, quietly and without any apparent emotion, "You are far more capable than I was led to expect." Thomas looked at her. "I appreciate that, ma'am." "I wonder," she said, "if you have any idea how rare that actually is." She rose before he could answer and moved toward the window, her back to him for a moment. Then she turned and smiled again, that same precise smile, and said, "Evelyn is very lucky. I hope you understand what you are walking into." Thomas did not fully understand what she meant. He assumed it was a reference to the complexities of the Whitmore family's financial situation during the war. He was wrong. Over the weeks that followed, Thomas remained at Ravenwood while he awaited further military orders. He spent his mornings with Evelyn walking the grounds, talking about the future they were beginning to plan together. He genuinely cared for her. He told her things about his family, about his fears, about the war, that he had never said to anyone else. Evelyn listened the way she always listened, fully, without judgment, with a presence that made a person feel, for just a moment, that they were the only living soul in the world. But Charlotte was always nearby. She appeared during those morning walks with urgent questions about estate business that only Thomas, as a lawyer, could help her navigate. She sought his opinion on contracts, on land disputes, on letters from creditors that had arrived since Henry's death. The questions were legitimate. The frequency was not. "She does this," Evelyn said one evening, her voice careful, when Thomas mentioned that Charlotte had asked him to review a document that afternoon. "She needs to be the one people depend on. Even when she asks for help, she is really just making sure you cannot do without her." Thomas looked at her. "That sounds like you've thought about this for a long time." "I have lived with her for 21 years, Evelyn said. "I have had nothing but time." It was the first real warning she gave him. He heard it. He simply did not understand yet how seriously to take it. By early summer, something had shifted in the atmosphere of Ravenwood in the way that pressure shifts before a storm. You could not see it directly. You could only feel it in the small things. The way Charlotte smiled at Thomas lasted a half-second longer than it should have. The way she remembered every detail of every conversation he had mentioned, even things said in passing weeks earlier. The way she found reasons to be in whatever room he happened to be working in. And Thomas, for his part, found himself looking forward to those conversations more than he wanted to admit. Charlotte was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. She had a way of making you feel discovered, as though she had seen something in you that the rest of the world had always missed. It was a dangerous feeling. He knew it was dangerous, even while he was feeling it. The servants noticed. Older women who had been at Ravenwood for decades watched with the careful, silent attention of people who understood that what they were witnessing had happened before, in different forms, under different names, in a house that had never once let anyone leave unchanged. One of them, a woman named Ada, who had worked in the Whitmore kitchen for 30 years, pulled a younger girl aside one morning and said, very quietly, her voice stripped down to nothing but truth, "You keep your eyes open in this house, and you keep your mouth shut, because what is growing in here is going to cost somebody everything. It always does." The younger girl looked at her and asked who it was going to cost. Ada shook her head slowly and went back to her work without answering, because she already knew, and deep in the part of herself that she had spent 21 years learning to silence, so did Evelyn. Ada had been right. She was always right. And the tragedy of being right inside a house like Ravenwood was that being right never saved anyone. The shift happened the way the worst things always happen. Not all at once, but in pieces small enough that each one alone seemed almost forgivable. A longer conversation in the library. A hand that lingered a breath too long on a shoulder. A letter that was meant for Evelyn, but somehow ended up opened on Charlotte's writing desk first. Thomas noticed each of these things and told himself a reasonable story about each one. He was a lawyer. He was trained to construct narratives that made sense of evidence. The problem was that the narrative he was constructing was the one Charlotte wanted him to believe. She was extraordinary at that. She never pushed. She pulled. She created a kind of gravity around herself that was so subtle, so patient, so perfectly calibrated to the specific weaknesses of whoever she was drawing in, that the person being drawn in almost always believed they had chosen to move toward her on their own. Thomas Caldwell, for all his intelligence, for all his training, was no different from anyone else who had ever stood in Charlotte Whitmore's orbit. He felt chosen. He felt seen. And that feeling was a door she had unlocked deliberately and left wide open. By midsummer of 1863, Thomas had begun visiting Evelyn less in the mornings. He told himself it was because Charlotte needed his legal counsel on an urgent land matter. He told himself it was temporary. He told Evelyn the same thing, and she looked at him with those warm, searching eyes of hers and said nothing, which was worse than anything she could have said out loud. One evening, Evelyn found Thomas and Charlotte seated together in the library, long after the household was supposed to be asleep. They were not doing anything that could be named. They were simply sitting close together, speaking in low voices, laughing softly at something that had nothing to do with estate business. The candle between them threw light on both their faces, and in that light, Evelyn saw something pass between them, an ease, an intimacy, a comfort that she had spent months trying to convince herself was not there. She stepped back from the doorway before either of them saw her. She walked to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed both hands flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. And then she made a decision that would define the next 2 years of her life. She decided she would not confront her mother yet, not because she was weak, but because she understood, with a clarity that cut through her like cold water, that if she confronted Charlotte without proof, without witnesses, without something solid in her hands, Charlotte would simply rearrange the truth until Evelyn looked like the one who had lost her mind. Charlotte was that good, and Evelyn had known her long enough to know it. So she waited. She watched, and she listened. What she heard over the following weeks made her wish she had stayed ignorant. Servants talk. Not openly, not to people they have no reason to trust, but in the spaces between their work, in the kitchen before dawn, in the narrow hallways when the family was occupied elsewhere. They talk because silence is its own kind of suffocation. And what they were saying about Charlotte and Thomas had passed well beyond speculation. A woman named Cora, who worked in the upstairs rooms, told Ada one morning in a voice so low it was barely more than breath that she had seen Thomas leaving Charlotte's private corridor before 4 in the morning. Twice. Ada did not respond. She just kept working, her hands moving steadily, her face revealing nothing. Because Ada understood something that Cora did not yet fully understand. The danger in that house was not just the scandal. The danger was what happened to people who knew too much. 3 weeks later, a man named Dr. Harlan Foster came to Ravenwood. He was the plantation physician, had been for years, a quiet and methodical man who had signed the death certificate for Colonel Henry Whitmore 4 years earlier. He came that afternoon not for a medical visit, but to speak with Charlotte privately. He had been at a gathering in town the previous week, he said, and certain things had been said about the Whitmore household that concerned him. He thought she should know. He thought, perhaps, something should be done. Charlotte thanked him graciously. She poured him tea herself. She listened to everything he had to say with the focused attention of a woman who was already deciding how to respond before he finished his first sentence. Doctor. Foster left Ravenwood that afternoon, looking relieved, the way people look when they have unburdened themselves of something heavy. He was dead within 10 days. The cause of death listed in the records was cardiac failure. He was 51 years old and had been, by all accounts, in excellent health. Ada heard about it while picking up supplies in town. She came home and sat alone in the kitchen for a long time without moving. Then she looked across the room at Cora and said quietly, "You did not see anything. You did not hear anything. Do you understand me?" Cora started to speak. Ada cut her off. "I am not asking. I am telling you. For your life, you did not see a single thing." Cora nodded. Her hands were trembling. She never spoke of it again. Back inside the house, Thomas was beginning to feel the first cold drafts of something he could not name. He was a man of logic, of precedent, of documented evidence, and what he was experiencing did not fit any framework he had been trained to use. Charlotte had become the center of everything, his days, his reasoning, his sense of what was real and what was not. When he was with her, he felt a clarity that he could not explain. When he was away from her, even for a few hours, the clarity dissolved and left behind something closer to dread. He knew that was not right. He knew it even as he was experiencing it. But knowing a thing and being able to step outside of it are two entirely different abilities. He tried once to speak to Evelyn about it. He found her one evening sitting alone, reading, and he sat down across from her and said her name. She looked up. He opened his mouth, and then he could not find a single honest sentence to begin with, because every honest sentence led directly to an admission that would have destroyed her completely. So he said something about missing their morning walks. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her book and said, very quietly, "Thomas, I know what is happening in this house. I have known for months. What I do not know yet is whether you are her victim or her partner. I am watching to find out." He left the room without answering. Because he did not know the answer himself, that question, victim or partner, became the fault line that the rest of the story would split along. Because by autumn of 1863, a man arrived at Ravenwood who had the potential to expose everything. His name was Gerald Marsh, a distant cousin of the Whitmores from Virginia, a man with sharp eyes and a long memory, and absolutely no instinct for self-preservation. He had heard rumors, as people in the extended family had, and he came to Ravenwood under the pretense of a family visit, with the actual intention of confronting Charlotte directly. He made it as far as dinner. Over the meal, he was charming and careful, watching Charlotte the way a man watches something he knows is dangerous, but believes he can outmaneuver. At one point, while Charlotte had stepped briefly from the table, he leaned across toward Thomas and said, low and fast, "I know what she is. I have seen it before, in another family, another county. You need to get out of this house before she decides you have become more of a problem than an asset. Do you understand what I am saying to you?" Thomas stared at him. His mouth was dry. He said nothing. Gerald looked at him and shook his head slowly. "She already has you," he said. "God help you." Charlotte returned to the table. She looked at both of them with that perfect, measured smile and said, "I hope I have not missed anything important." Gerald laughed and said, "Of course not." But his hand, Thomas noticed, was gripping the edge of the table, white-knuckled tight. Gerald Marsh stayed at Ravenwood for 4 days. On the morning of his planned departure, he complained of a sudden illness, violent and fast-moving, the kind that nails a man to his bed before he fully understands what is happening to his body. A local doctor was summoned. The doctor looked confused and concerned and prescribed rest. Gerald's fingernails, by the second day, had begun to darken at the edges. By the third day, the room he was sleeping in carried a faint, bitter scent that no one in the house mentioned out loud. On the 4th day, Gerald Marsh was dead. Thomas sat alone in the library that night after the body had been prepared and the household had gone quiet. He sat completely still for a very long time. He thought about what Gerald had said at dinner. He thought about Dr. Foster. He thought about Colonel Henry Whitmore and his sudden fever 4 years ago. He thought about all the reasonable explanations he had constructed for each of these things, one by one, over months, because reasonable explanations had been more comfortable than the truth. And then, for the first time since arriving at Ravenwood Plantation, Thomas Caldwell allowed himself to understand exactly what kind of woman Charlotte Whitmore actually was. The candle on the desk burned down to nothing. The house went completely dark, and Thomas sat in that darkness and felt, with total certainty, that the only question that mattered now was whether Charlotte still needed him, or whether he had already become the next name on a list that no one was supposed to know existed. Thomas did not sleep that night. He sat in the dark long after the candle died, and when the first gray light finally pushed through the windows of Ravenwood, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years between sunset and sunrise. Because he had finally let himself see what had been in front of him for months, and seeing the truth clearly, after working so hard to avoid it, has a cost. It takes something from you that does not come back. He understood now. Gerald Marsh had not died of illness. Dr. Foster had not died of a failed heart, and Colonel Henry Whitmore, whose grave sat at the edge of the property in soil that had never been disturbed by any court or investigation, had almost certainly not died of fever. Thomas sat with those 3 names lined up in his mind like stones in a wall, and he understood that he was looking at the architecture of a woman who removed obstacles the way other people removed splinters, quickly, efficiently, with no more emotion than the task required. The question that had kept him awake was still sitting on his chest when he finally stood up and walked out of the library. Not whether Charlotte was capable of murder. He had moved past that. The question was what she wanted from him now, whether he was still useful, whether she saw him as a partner in what she was building, or whether his usefulness had an expiration date that he could not read from the outside. He found her at breakfast, seated at the head of the table, perfectly composed, eating with the measured appetite of someone who had slept without interruption. She looked up when he entered. She smiled. And in that smile, Thomas saw something he had never let himself see before. Not warmth, not affection, Assessment. She was always assessing. "You look exhausted," she said. "I did not sleep well," he answered. "Grief affects people differently," she said. She was referring to Gerald. He was family, of course. It is natural to feel it. Thomas sat down. He looked at her directly. "What killed him, Charlotte?" The room went very still. Not a single sound from anywhere in the house. Charlotte set down her fork. She looked at him with an expression so calm it was almost clinical. "The doctor said it was his heart. You were there when he said it." "I was," Thomas said. "I was also there when Gerald was in better health than most men half his age, 4 days before he died." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork again and said, quietly and without any change in her tone, "Thomas, be very careful about the questions you decide to ask inside this house. Some questions have answers that cannot be unheard, and once you have heard them, you become responsible for them. Do you understand what I am telling you?" He understood exactly what she was telling him. She was not denying it. She was warning him. She was telling him, in the most elegant and terrifying way possible, that knowing the truth made him complicit in it, whether he wanted to be or not. It was the same principle she had used from the beginning. Pull a person close enough, make them dependent enough, and their silence becomes self-preservation. Thomas nodded slowly. He ate his breakfast. He said nothing more. And Charlotte watched him across the table with those steady, measuring eyes and seemed satisfied by what she saw. What she did not see, because she had never once in her life fully credited another person's inner life, was what was happening inside him in that moment. A decision was forming, small and fragile at first, the way all real decisions are before they harden into action. But it was there. Evelyn came down late that morning, later than usual. She looked pale and had clearly not slept well either. She sat at the far end of the table and poured her own coffee, and did not look at either of them. The three of them sat in that room together, all carrying their separate versions of the same unbearable truth, and the silence between them had a texture to it, thick and pressurized, like the air before a storm breaks. After Charlotte left the room, Evelyn looked at Thomas across the length of the table. She said, "Gerald is dead." "Yes," Thomas said. "He came here to help," she said. "He wrote to me before he arrived. He told me what he suspected. He said he was coming to confront her." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Then she said, "I told him not to come, Thomas. I wrote back and I told him it was not safe. But he came anyway because he was a stubborn, decent man who believed that decency was enough to protect him." She stopped again. Her voice was very steady, which somehow made it harder to listen to than if she had been crying. "It is not enough. It has never been enough in this house." Thomas said her name. He started to reach across the table. She pulled her hand back before he could touch it. "Do not," she said. Simply that. Do not. And the word carried 21 years of watching her mother consume everything around her, and Thomas heard all of it. By February of 1864, the war had pressed in closer. The sounds of distant artillery had become a regular part of the nights at Ravenwood. Supply chains were collapsing. Food was becoming scarcer. The plantation's economic foundation was cracking at every joint, and Charlotte was fighting that collapse with the same cold precision she applied to everything else. She wrote letters to creditors in language that made them feel they were doing her a favor by waiting. She negotiated with supply merchants who had no reason to give her favorable terms and walked away with exactly what she needed. She was, in the most practical sense, keeping Ravenwood alive through sheer force of will, while everything around it was dying. But she was also beginning to make a mistake. A small one, invisible at first, the kind that people who have operated without consequences for long enough always eventually make.
She had started to believe she was untouchable.
A traveling businessman named Warren Hale arrived at Ravenwood in early March, referred by a creditor in Charleston who believed Charlotte might be interested in a land transaction. He stayed 3 days. He was observant in the way that merchants are observant, cataloging everything, assigning value, reading people the way they read ledgers. On his second evening, he happened to be passing the corridor near Charlotte's private rooms when he heard something that stopped him in the hallway. A voice, Charlotte's voice, low and very deliberate, speaking to someone he could not see. He could not make out all the words, but he heard enough. He heard a name, Gerald Marsh's name. And he heard Charlotte say, with no more weight than someone discussing a business transaction that had been concluded satisfactorily, "It was necessary. He would have destroyed everything I have built. You do not apologize for protecting what is yours." Warren Hale stood in that hallway for 10 full seconds. Then he walked back to his room, packed his bag with quiet, methodical efficiency, and left Ravenwood before dawn the following morning, without telling anyone he was going. He rode 30 miles to the next county before he stopped. He sat in a roadside tavern and ordered a drink, and thought about what he had heard and what he was going to do with it. He thought about it for a long time. He never told anyone, not because he lacked courage, but because 2 weeks later, before he had made a decision about who to tell or how, Warren Hale died in his room at a boarding house in Augusta. Convulsions, darkened fingernails, the faint smell, noted by the landlady and promptly forgotten, of something sharp and bitter she could not identify. Nobody connected it to Ravenwood. Nobody was looking. But Thomas was. Thomas had been looking, quietly and very carefully, since the morning after Gerald died. He had been keeping notes, not on paper, because paper in Ravenwood was never truly private, but in his memory, organized and sequenced the way he had been trained to organize evidence. He was building a case in his mind, not for a court, not yet, for himself. Because before he could decide what to do, he needed to understand the full architecture of what Charlotte had constructed, and how deep inside it he actually was. What he discovered over those months of careful watching shook him in a way he had not anticipated. It was not just the deaths, it was the precision. Each one had occurred at exactly the moment a person had become a specific kind of threat. Each one had been covered by a diagnosis that was plausible enough to satisfy a doctor who was either afraid, uninformed, or both. And each one had been preceded by a period during which Charlotte had been exceptionally warm and generous toward the victim, as if she needed to ensure their guard was completely down before she acted. He thought about his own arrival at Ravenwood, the way she had met him at the door, the things she had said to him in those first weeks, the feeling of being chosen, of being seen. He understood now that what he had experienced was not connection. It was preparation. She had been making him comfortable before she made him hers. And then the worst thought arrived, the one he had been circling for weeks without letting himself land on it directly. If he tried to leave, if he made it clear that he was a threat rather than an asset, what would stop her from adding his name to that silent, growing list? He went looking for Evelyn that afternoon. He found her alone, and he sat down across from her, and he said with no preamble and no softness, because there was no time left for either, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I believe your mother has killed at least 3 people that I can account for. I believe she is capable of killing again. And I believe we are both in danger if she decides that we know too much." Evelyn looked at him. She did not look surprised. She did not flinch. She simply looked at him with those eyes of hers, steady and deeply tired, and said, "I know, Thomas. I have known since my father died." She paused. "The question I have been asking myself every day for 5 years is not whether she did it. The question is who in this world would ever believe us."
The answer to that question, it turned out, was no one. Not yet. Not in Georgia. Not in 1864, in the middle of a war that had already consumed every institution capable of delivering justice.
Thomas knew it as soon as she said it, and in knowing it, he understood that the only move left available to either of them was the one he had been dreading since that morning in the dark library. Not confrontation, not exposure. Survival. Getting out of Ravenwood with their lives intact, before Charlotte decided that the risk they represented had finally outweighed the use she still had for them. He reached across the table. This time, Evelyn did not pull her hand away.
That moment, Evelyn's hand staying in his, neither of them pulling away, lasted only a few seconds before Thomas released it and stood up. There was no tenderness in the gesture. It was not reconciliation. It was two people standing on the same burning ground finally acknowledging that they were both on fire. The plan they made that afternoon was not dramatic. It could not afford to be. Charlotte noticed everything, and anything that looked like urgency, like escape, like two people coordinating without her knowledge, would trigger exactly the response they were trying to avoid. So they moved slowly, deliberately. The way you move when you know the floor beneath you has rotted through, and the only way across is to test every single step before you trust it with your weight. Thomas began drafting letters. Not to courts, not to newspapers, not to anyone in Savannah who existed inside Charlotte's web of influence and obligation. He wrote to a former law partner in Philadelphia, a man named Edmund Cross, who had no connection to Georgia, no reason to fear Charlotte Whitmore, and enough integrity to be trusted with something that could get a man killed if it landed in the wrong hands. The letters were careful, coded in the way that lawyers learn to code things, specific without being explicit, detailed enough to be useful, vague enough to be survivable if intercepted. He hid them inside a false bottom he constructed in his travel trunk and waited for a safe moment to get them to a postal rider heading north. Evelyn, for her part, did what she had always done inside Ravenwood. She watched. She listened. She performed normalcy with the exhausting precision of someone who had been performing it since childhood. She sat at dinner. She answered her mother's questions. She laughed at appropriate moments. And all the while, behind those warm and searching eyes, she was cataloging everything, every inconsistency, every name, every date she could remember, building a record of her own that existed nowhere except inside her own memory, which was the only place in Ravenwood that Charlotte could not reach. Charlotte noticed nothing, or so they believed. In late April of 1864, she called Thomas into the library alone. She closed the door. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the desk in front of her with that particular stillness that Thomas had learned to recognize as the posture she assumed when she was about to say something that required all of his attention.
"I want to talk about Evelyn," she said.
Thomas kept his face neutral.
"Of course." "She has been distant lately," Charlotte said, "more so than usual. I am concerned about her state of mind."
She paused.
I think it might be best if she were to visit relatives in Virginia, a change of setting, some time away from the pressures of the house during the war. She looked at him directly.
I think it would be good for her. Do you not agree?
Thomas understood immediately what was happening. Charlotte was not concerned about Evelyn's state of mind. She was concerned about Evelyn's knowledge. Sending her to Virginia was not a kindness. It was removal. It was isolating the one person in Ravenwood who had both the motivation and the intelligence to expose her. He said, I think that is something Evelyn should decide for herself. Charlotte's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted just slightly, like a gear moving to a new position. Of course, she said. I only meant that a mother's concern, Charlotte, Thomas said, and the way he said her name, quiet, flat, without the careful deference he had maintained for 2 years, stopped her mid-sentence. I think we both know what you meant. The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence Thomas had ever sat inside. He could feel it pressing against him from every direction. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, not warmly,
The way a person smiles when they have just decided something.
"You have been thinking a great deal lately," she said. "I have," he agreed. "I hope," she said, standing slowly, smoothing her dress with both hands, "that all that thinking has led you somewhere sensible." She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "Ravenwood is a complicated place, Thomas."
The people who do well here are the ones who understand that some things are larger than any individual's conscience. Remember that. She left. Thomas sat completely still for 60 seconds. Then he went directly to his room, retrieved the letters from the false bottom of his trunk, and that same afternoon paid a stable hand, a young man he had quietly cultivated a cautious trust with over several months, to carry the letters to a postal rider heading north. He gave the young man enough money to make it worth the risk and looked him in the eye and said, "Tell no one, not one word. Your safety depends on it as much as mine." The young man nodded. He understood what it meant to carry a secret inside Ravenwood. He had been doing it his entire life. 3 days later, Evelyn disappeared from the plantation. Not by force, not visibly. Charlotte announced at breakfast that Evelyn had agreed to the visit to Virginia and had departed early that morning before the household was fully awake. She said it the way she said everything, calmly, factually, as though it were simply an item of scheduling. Thomas looked at her across the table and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not confirm to Charlotte exactly how much he knew. But what Charlotte did not know was that Evelyn had not gone to Virginia. She had gone north, on a route that Thomas had arranged through Edmund Cross's network of contacts, carrying nothing but a small bag, the address of a woman in Philadelphia who would ask no questions and require no explanations, and every name, date, and detail she had memorized over 5 years inside Ravenwood House. She was 23 years old. She was alone. She was leaving behind the only home she had ever known, and the man who had been her fiancé before her mother had consumed him, and the graves of a father and 3 others whose deaths had never been properly accounted for. She did not look back at the road behind her. She could not afford to. Back at Ravenwood, the walls began to close in faster. By the summer of 1864, Thomas had received a reply from Edmund Cross. It was cautious and measured, the way all of Cross's communications were. But beneath the careful language was something Thomas had not allowed himself to hope for. Cross believed him. And Cross had contacts in the legal community, in the press, in the federal government that was, as the war turned, becoming increasingly interested in the crimes that had been committed in the shadow of the Southern plantation system. Not just the institutional ones, but the personal ones that the old aristocracy had used their power to bury. Thomas began writing more detailed accounts. He named names. He cited dates. He described symptoms. He was careful to write only what he had directly witnessed or could directly corroborate, because he knew that Charlotte's family connections, even in a collapsing Confederacy, were deep enough to destroy any case built on rumor or emotion. He needed facts. He had facts, and for the first time since arriving at Ravenwood, he felt something other than dread when he thought about the future. That was when Charlotte moved. He came back to his room one evening to find it had been searched carefully. The kind of careful that is meant to look undisturbed, but that a man who has been living on high alert for months recognizes immediately from a dozen tiny displacements. His trunk had been opened. The false bottom had been found. The letters he had not yet sent were gone. Thomas stood in the center of that room and understood that he had run out of time. He did not go to dinner that night. He told the household he was unwell. He sat in his room and made a decision that he had been approaching for months and had never quite been able to reach. He was leaving Ravenwood that night.
He would take nothing that would slow him down, and he would not stop until he was far enough away that Charlotte's reach could not follow him. He was packed in 20 minutes. He left through a side door before midnight. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He simply walked into the dark and kept walking.
Charlotte discovered he was gone the following morning. The household said later that she stood at the top of the stairs for a very long time without moving, and then walked back to her room and closed the door, and no one saw her for the rest of that day. The war ended in April of 1865. Ravenwood lost its land. The Whitmore fortune dissolved almost overnight as the economic structure that had built it collapsed into history. Charlotte remained in the house alone, while the columns cracked and the fields went to weeds, and the world that had protected her reputation dismantled itself around her. She died in 1891. The local obituary described her as one of Savannah's last great ladies, dignified, resilient, a model of Southern endurance through the war years. Not one word of it was true, in any way that mattered. But truth in the American South of the 19th century had always been a luxury, available primarily to the people with the power to define it. And Charlotte Whitmore had understood that principle better than almost anyone. The house sat empty for 27 years, and then, in 1918, workers renovating the abandoned structure found the hidden compartment behind the library wall. Inside it, the box of letters. Thomas Caldwell's letters, the ones Charlotte had taken from his room that last evening, the ones she had chosen to hide rather than destroy, which was itself a revelation about her character. She had kept them, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as a record of her own power, perhaps because some part of her had wanted the truth preserved, even if only in a place where no one would find it until she was long past accountability. The letters told everything, every death, every name, every calculated step. When investigators finally pieced the story together, they found a record of at least 5 deaths connected to Ravenwood House across a span of 6 years. None of them had ever been properly investigated. None of them had ever been questioned by any authority with the power to act. Evelyn Whitmore lived until 1922 in Philadelphia. She never returned to Georgia. She never spoke publicly about what had happened at Ravenwood, though the investigators who found the letters tried repeatedly to reach her for a statement. She declined every time. Her reasons were her own, and she took them with her. Thomas Caldwell was never found. Edmund Cross told investigators only that Thomas had left the country sometime after the war's end and had made clear he did not wish to be located. Whether guilt drove him away or simply the need to survive his own history, no one ever knew for certain. What remained was the house, the letters, and the silence that had surrounded Charlotte Whitmore for 30 years while she moved through Savannah society, unquestioned and untouched. The silence of servants who had been afraid for their lives. The silence of a legal system that had no interest in looking too closely at the deaths of people connected to a powerful white family during wartime. The silence of a daughter who had understood from the time she was a child that some truths inside certain families are simply not survivable. Ravenwood House was demolished in 1923. Nothing was rebuilt on the land for decades. The locals said the ground itself felt wrong, heavy, unquiet, the way ground feels when it has absorbed too many things that were never properly put to rest. They were not wrong, because the most enduring crimes in American history were never the ones that made it into courtrooms or history books. They were the ones that happened inside houses like Ravenwood, behind closed doors and perfect manners, and the kind of social authority that made witnesses go silent and investigators look the other way. They were the crimes committed by people who understood that in a society built on the power of the few over the many, the greatest protection available to a criminal was simply the right name, the right address, and the absolute certainty that no one with the power to stop them would ever choose to try. Charlotte Whitmore knew that. She built her entire life on it, and for 30 years, she was right.
Until the walls of the house she had poisoned finally gave up her secrets to a pair of workers with a crowbar and a hidden compartment that was never meant to be found. The truth had been waiting in the dark for 53 years, and when it finally came out all at once. Every name, every death, every calculated act. Exactly the way suppressed things always eventually do. Patient, complete, unforgiving.